McKinney, and this is Tipping Point.
We will not take this. We will fight back.
Fight back. Fight back.
And as I close out, because I know we've been out here for a long time, and shut down the Senate. We are at war. Anytime a person can pay $250 million into a campaign and they be given full access to the Department of Treasury of the United States of America, we are at war.
For everyone crying about an insurrection for the last 4 years, well, I don't know, here's your actual insurrection. Members of Congress are trying to usurp the power of the executive branch in direct opposition given to it by its mandate from the people of the United States. Strange that this is the issue that Democrats believe is the hill to die on politically. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency came after their left-wing patronage network at USAID and is now reviewing payments issued through the Treasury Department. Friend of the show, Greg Price, the rapid response director for President Trump's 2024 bid, points out that, quote, I assumed at the beginning of the Trump administration that the Democrats would be calling for war in the streets over the deportation of their voters. But it turns out they care even more about laundering as much of your money as possible to foreign countries and NGOs, end quote. Democrats have been out protesting for days now, and they aren't showing signs of letting up anytime soon. Here's Senator Ed Markey calling for another 2020-style color revolution for regime change there in D.C.
This is the time when we have to stand up and to fight, to not stand on the sidelines, to have people by the millions are going to have to stand up and protest. When we come back here the next time, there should be hundreds of thousands and millions of people descending on Washington, D.C.
Now, obviously, he's not going to put it into those exact terms that I use, but that's what he means. And since the funding spigots for those movements are what are directly under threat by Trump and Doge, don't be surprised if they do astroturf another year of rioting that they try to pretend is completely organic. Joining us now to discuss is military defense attorney Davis Younts. Davis, thanks for being here tonight.
Good evening, Kara.
Great. So sitting Democrat members of Congress say they are at war with what the American people voted for. I don't know. I think that's a little insurrection-y. I know I'm being a little loose with the term, but hey, they set that precedent. So what do you think?
I mean, listen, this is extremely dangerous rhetoric, but it's the same kind of rhetoric that we saw during the campaign. I mean, you have a sitting member of Congress openly calling it war and saying we are at war. How are people supposed to understand that to be, anything other than dangerous rhetoric? So I think this is just an example of where they are at. And the reality is, you said it very well. This is the executive branch. This is the executive branch exercising their authority over these discretionary acts. And quite frankly, you're looking at an organization in USAID that is overstepping any authorization it has. It was created by an executive order. So we shouldn't be surprised when executive orders are shutting it down and ensuring that taxpayer dollars are not being spent to further interests that are not for the benefit of the American people. We're just beginning to scratch the surface on the level of fraud, waste, and abuse that's there. And this absolutely appears to be money laundering organizations. You just have to watch the news, go on X, and you'll see repeated lists of people and organizations that are actively, campaigning against and trying to undermine the Trump administration that received money through USAID grants. It is just mind-blowing, the level of corruption that we're seeing.
That it is, and it's interesting. As Greg Price, when he pointed that out, it just all these little lights went on in my head, and I thought, that's so true. I think we were all bracing for the impact of the deportations being the big bugaboo for the left, that was what they were going to stake everything on, that they were going to try and juice up some riots over it, that they were going to try and get some images of crying people to splash all over the media, and that would be what we would have to, in a PR sense, defend against. But I think it shows how bad the open borders really was for Democrats in last year's election. Remember how Kamala tried to change up some of her rhetoric by trying to act like she and the Democrats were tough on the border border, which is laughable, right? We all know open borders, that's been their MO since the beginning. But their language tried to change because their internal polling showed that Democrats were even upset. You could see in states like New York, they were furious. In blue cities like Chicago, Democrat voters again were furious over what was being done with illegal immigration, how it was disrupting welfare benefits, disrupting youth leagues for kids, and of course the violence and everything else that comes with it. So that ended up being, I think, too much of a tough sell. And so now they're pivoting to what I think is an even deeper core issue for them, and it's this left-wing funding patronage network. I talked about it a little bit last night, right? We would always say wokeness. Who really believes in that? There's not a whole lot of true believers in it, but all the institutions of power all came out in full force, right, to enforce it on us. And then you think, oh, it's all the money, right? And you start to see the networks and what they were trying to do with the money. So, I mean, it's really no wonder, right, that this now is going to be the issue that these Democrats, live and die on.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we learn, the more we're realizing that these democratic entities and even news media outlets in other countries like the BBC, Politico in our own country, were getting grants and funding through USAID. I mean, just imagine what that means. It makes you almost feel foolish. Like, why didn't I start a non-governmental organization and get millions of dollars from the federal government? I wouldn't do that, but it's ridiculous when you start looking at the amount of money that's here and the corruption. And then you peel it back and you realize, wow, this is why these people, these so-called, religious charities and other organizations were advocating so hard against a Trump presidency. Because when Trump was talking about the deep state, part of what he was talking about is this, circular funding of these organizations. And I think as we go deeper into this, you're going to see more and more layers of corruption and just be shocked at the millions and millions, billions of dollars that are being wasted of American taxpayer money to fund things the American people would never support, even to fund things overseas that those governments in those other countries don't want to support. It's exporting this woke, communist Marxist agenda overseas, this immorality overseas. It is shocking. I'm just praising God. We're starting to see just the tip of the iceberg of what's there, and I'm glad it's happening to expose this to the light of day.
Yeah, and it's amazing, right? Because we would always say that the media, it acts as an extension or a guard dog, a barking guard dog for the Democrat Party. And a lot of that, I'm sure, is ideology within those institutions. A lot of them tend to be more left-wing minded types. But also we see, as you were saying a moment ago, with the money. And I think that maybe should have been what we were thinking about earlier. But as far as Politico goes, with the millions they were getting, as far as I've heard, a lot of that was undisclosed. So that wasn't even being disclosed outwardly. I think the Associated Press was on the take. I think I'm hearing there was some HHS funds as well that were going to the New York Times. So we start to see this growing picture. We remember how Big Pharma bought up all those ads during COVID and how it really skewed how the coverage of COVID-19, the vaccines and treatments for it, or lack thereof, since they didn't let us get too many effective treatments out there. But you start to see, right, this larger picture that's really coming to fruition. And as you mentioned, with exporting these ideas abroad, once again through journalistic outputs, the BBC and others. When we see with USAID, Mike Benz is great. He used to be in the State Department under Trump, and now he's really exposing a lot of this. But he was saying that the USAID money that we're using to pay for transgender videos, I just saw it on X in Ecuador, with all the men with the makeup on doing all sorts of weird stuff on our dime. But you see that, right? The abortion, the same-sex marriage, and on, all being exported. The interesting thing to note, though, when he was naming these countries and how it has directly led to instability, it's destabilized those nations, and that's what that's what our State Department, USAID, and the like, that's what they wanted, to make it easier to get what we wanted out of those nations. And then I started to think, well, wait a second, isn't that what China does, where they export all this left-wing wokeness, but they would never ever dare bring it upon themselves because they know how destabilizing it is. But then I'm thinking our own government, they're doing it abroad to destabilize, but they're doing it here to destabilize, right? And to me, that was a big alarm in my head.
Right. It just goes back to this question of what have we been doing in our government institutions, and why have we been allowing this government bureaucracy to go unchecked? And you look at it, our own government is funding the undermining of our traditional values and our fundamental institutions, just like we would do to destabilize countries overseas, just like China has done to destabilize countries. We're doing it to ourselves. It's not a conspiracy theory. We're seeing it openly being disclosed now as we go through this. So that's the real shock, is that we have lost control over the executive branch, the government bureaucracy. It is so large, it has gone so unchecked that we're using strategies to destabilize our own country on ourselves. And look back at the last 4 years, look back at the last 6 years, and just see everything that's happened. And it does start to go, wow, we were naive. We've talked about these things. We've talked about the problems with these, progressive communist woke ideologies infiltrating everything, but we have been reaping, the consequences of this just on our streets. And now, of course, they're fighting back. Of course, you have a sitting member of Congress talking about war. It shouldn't be surprising that we're now exposing this, and it's in its death throes, I hope, if the Trump administration can continue to root this stuff out.
And the fact that they could be putting it into those death throes, like you're saying, is why they're all out marching and why this is the thing that makes them angrier more than anything. And just one last point on Politico, when they were putting out that letter of the 51 intel agents who signed the letter promising that the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, don't even look at it. It has the hallmarks of Russian disinformation, right? And then I think it was Politico and other outlets at the time during the 2020 election who said, oh, we don't even want to touch this story. There's nothing here to it. Avert your eyes, don't look at the man behind the curtain. And that was her reporting. And now when we see the funding, it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not just the national security agencies that were trying to interfere in our elections, because that letter of the intel agents was supposed to be, in emails that came out, right, was supposed to give, I think it was Sullivan who was saying, would give a talking point to Biden to use in his debates against then President Trump when he was President 45, to use against him on the debate stage against Joe Biden. That is so political. They were trying to interfere, and they did, unfortunately, in 2020, successfully interfere in that election. But now we're finding out there's a lot more federal agencies involved in all of that. Now, when we talk about cleaning house, another story I wanted to get to tonight with you is a headline talking about how the FBI just revealed that 5,000 of their 13,000 agents were focused on January 6th protesters. So that's about almost 40% of the Bureau, and that the FBI now, under President Trump's acting director, has been forced to hand over about 5,000 of their employees who are working on these J6 cases to do political persecution, essentially. So what do you think should happen to some of these agents? Should we see a mass firing, more purges? Should they be reassigned? Should President Trump keep taking this giant wrecking ball to these institutions? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think all of the above is what we have to look at. I mean, sadly, I'm not surprised by this number, both from my clients and even FBI agents that I've represented and worked with. I knew it was bad. I knew that they were siphoning resources off to fight actual crimes, to focus on January 6ers and anyone else labeled an extremist. I've had multiple military clients who just made a combat, for example, about women shouldn't be in combat, and somebody reported them as an extremist, and then the FBI would come to their house and interview them. The FBI would come to their house, another military member I represent, over a meme. And it doesn't seem real. It seems surreal. But that's just the level of corruption, the level of political infiltration we're seeing. So there's still a lot of good FBI agents in the department. The problem is that any of those that actually want to do their job, all of those resources were siphoned off for these January 6 cases. So imagine, at 40% of the FBI is focused on grandmothers who walked across the lawn and took a tour through open doors of the Capitol. I mean, that is astounding. And it really was political persecution, something like you would see in a tyrannical communist country. I mean, this was Soviet-style persecution, and we're just beginning to understand it. So yes, there should be an absolute wrecking ball taken to the FBI. The lead agents, these in many of the offices, were political appointees that need to be removed, and we need to allow, to the extent we need an FBI, we need to go back to the basics of fighting dangerous criminals and making our streets safer, and not using them as an arm of a tyrannical federal government to implement a political plan.
Yeah, and it was just the shock and awe, as they called it under Biden, right? It's to scare Trump supporters, because anyone who was anywhere within the vicinity of the Capitol, even those who were stuck their pinky toe over the line for 2 minutes to take a selfie, or those who didn't even enter the Capitol building itself, were being brought up on all sorts of charges. And so the idea was to isolate Trump supporters for the next 4 years was don't protest whatsoever, because you don't know what those feds are going to do, how they're going to try and, juice up some of these protests to then try and get convictions out of it. It's scary. So then people would stay home. They wouldn't protest. They were too afraid to, even if they had real issues they need to get off their chest. And then it was designed to then isolate, because if no one's protesting, then it seems like everyone loves good old Joe Biden, when obviously that's manifestly not the case. So, I mean, it's just so political all the way around. But like you said, we're finally making that institutional change. And I think that's been the greatest aspect so far of President Trump's, 2 weeks in office? It's been great. Davis, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hey, thank you. Take care.
It's left to men like Davis Younts to fight for these Navy SEALs.
R. Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officer.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending service members.
Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant